Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I'd like for us to look at two episodes from the Bible in the prophet Isaiah's life, because the contrast in these two episodes is critical for us in the situation we find ourselves in right now in our world in 2020. A lot of folks think the Bible is a story about somebody else at some other time in some other place. But what we find is the Bible, in part, is our story, the story of humanity. And these particular episodes are so very relevant for us. Now, Isaiah lived in the 8th century BC, and he was one of the prophets of God sent to the nation of Israel. He was a prophet of God, a messenger of God, one of 9 prophets God sent during this kind of 200-year era of Israel's history. And he was a big dog. Isaiah was considered a major prophet. There were minor prophets, there were major prophets, and Isaiah was a major prophet. And at this point, the nation of Israel has come to this place where they become a divided nation. Israel has this civil war, and they end up divided into a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And they just don't like each other. And what's happening now is Assyria is becoming dominant as a superpower. Assyria is flexing its muscle and gobbling up all the countries around them. That's the backdrop against which Isaiah's ministry takes place. And the great question is, when this superpower, Assyria, emerges, will the people of God give in to fear and do foolish, impulsive, destructive things, or will they trust God and turn to Him for help? Will they give in to fear, or will they trust God? That's the issue with the rising of Assyria. So if you have a Bible, get to the 7th chapter of the book of Isaiah. 2 main stories from the ministry of the prophet Isaiah. And the first one takes place before Assyria has taken over the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah, they both still exist. But Assyria is rising. You understand? Assyria is on the march. It's gobbling up all the smaller countries around them. And we find out in chapter 7 that 2 of these small countries, Israel, which is the northern kingdom, and another one, Aram, they decide they're going to join forces to try and stop Assyria. And they want King Ahaz, who is the king of the southern kingdom, Judah, to join them. And King Ahaz of the southern kingdom says, no way I'm going to go up against Assyria. So Israel and Aram decide that they're going to go to war against Ahaz and get him overthrown and force Ahaz and the southern kingdom to help them against Assyria. So Ahaz starts to panic because Israel and Aram are going to come fight him. Verse 2 here, now the house of David, it's another way of talking about Ahaz, who's ruling over Jerusalem and Judah. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, and then this is a real picturesque phrase, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. All right, so Ahaz is overcome now by anxiety and worry. Now put yourself in Ahaz's place for a second. Assyria is the strongest kid on the block. Israel and Aram hate Assyria. Israel and Aram are fighting against Ahaz. Who might Ahaz be tempted to turn to for help? Assyria. He might actually go and try to come under the protection of Assyria. But here's the problem. That's not God's plan. God is going to use Assyria to bring judgment on the northern kingdom because of their unfaithfulness, especially because of their treatment of the poor. But Assyria is filled with idolatry and violence and corruption, and God doesn't want King Ahaz in the southern kingdom. He doesn't want Judah there associated with that. So he has Isaiah, the prophet, tell King Ahaz, don't link up with Assyria. Don't ally yourself with Assyria. Instead, trust God. Just trust God. He'll deliver you. He'll take care of you. Check out chapter 7, verse 3. The Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz. Say to him, be careful, keep calm, don't be afraid. Those are phenomenal commands. Don't lose heart because of these 2 smoldering stumps of firewood. Because of the fierce anger of Razin and Aram and the son of Ramaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Ramaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it amongst ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says. It will not take place. It will not happen. And God expands on that there. Then check out bottom of verse 9. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. If you don't stand firm in your faith, you won't stand at all. Now, because God knows that King Ahaz is wavering in his faith, he makes an incredible offer. Verse 10, again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. Now, this is extremely unusual. I mean, as a general rule, people are not encouraged to look for signs from God. But because Ahaz has such little faith, God volunteers in Isaiah 7:11 to give him a sign. Isaiah 7:11 is a very unique verse. God says, I'll give you a sign. Ask for a miraculous demonstration of my power. I'll give it to you to strengthen your faith, to bolster your courage, and to show you that I'll take care of you. Now, you'd think that Ahaz would be thrilled with this verse, you know? I mean, you'd think Ahaz would say, oh, thank heaven for 7:11. You know, I knew that was borderline. I probably won't say it at the outdoor service, but if I do, I bet they'll be glad. Anyway, he doesn't say that. Look at verse 12. It's very interesting. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not ask for a sign. I will not put the Lord to the test. He says, no thanks on the sign. And he covers it up with a thin veneer of piety. You know, we shouldn't put God to the test. But that doesn't fool Isaiah at all. Now, why did he not obey Isaiah? Why didn't Ahaz ask God for a sign? Well, he wanted to keep his options open to disobey God. That's exactly why. He knew if he agreed to submit to God, the options he felt he needed most would no longer be available to him. And he wanted to keep the Assyrian option open. So you got to trust something. You got to trust somebody. And Ahaz decided he'd trust Assyria because Assyria was the biggest kid on the block. Now, I think, CCC, this is a deep truth about human nature. We all like to think we want to do what's right, but we want to keep our options open too. We want an escape route, even though I know God wouldn't approve. Like, you know, I'd like to be honest, I really would, but if I'm in a desperate situation, you know, if I really have to make sure the outcome, I'm not sure I can trust God to take care of me if I just speak the truth. So privately, without ever using these words, you know, covering it up with a veneer of spirituality, privately, I'll keep the right to deceive, to kind of shade the truth a bit. And I get it. It's a scary thing to say, I'll cut off the option of deception, of manipulation, of hype, of selling, you know, whatever. I'll cut myself off from that. I'll simply speak the truth, and then I'll trust God. Well, Isaiah goes to enormous lengths to reassure Ahaz. God decides to give Ahaz a sign, even though Ahaz wouldn't even ask for it. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. This is Isaiah speaking. The Lord said to me, take a large scroll and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. I will call on Uriah the priest and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah, as reliable witnesses for me. Isaiah says, then I went to the prophetess and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Interestingly enough, Isaiah, a prophet, is married to a prophetess. And the Lord said to me, name him Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Before the boy knows how to say my father and my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. Now, parenthetically here, aren't you glad you weren't one of Isaiah's kids? I mean, wouldn't you hate having to go around with the name Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz? I mean, you wouldn't just take a spelling test. You'd be the spelling test. Anyway, God here is using names, as he often does in the Bible, to reveal his plans. And this name, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, means quick to plunder, swift to spoil. God is saying that Aram and Israel, the northern kingdom, they are about to be plundered by Assyria. And the southern kingdom is going to be safe. And this child here is a sign. Ahaz could have said, I saw the signs. And it opened up my eyes. I saw the signs. But even after all this, even still, Ahaz won't trust God. He ends up making a deal with Assyria. He did the opposite of what God told him to do through Isaiah. and Assyria ruined his life. He became a slave to the king of Assyria. He takes the silver and gold that the people had given, that the people had sacrificed for to the temple, for the worship of God. He takes all that and he just ships it off to Assyria. No longer will it be used to worship God. He has altars built to the Assyrian gods, and he leads the Israelites, the people under him, away from the one true God and into idolatry. He took his own son, placed the body of his own son in a fire, and watched his son burn to death as a sacrifice to their gods. I mean, you think about this. You think he wanted his life to end up like this? You think he set out to murder his child or sacrifice his freedom or mislead his people, betray his God? It's tragic. So why does he do it? Well, we don't know a lot of details, but I'll tell you what I think. I think mostly it was fear. Because fear, when it's handled wrongly, it makes people selfish and impulsive and foolish and untrusting. Fear dries up the ability for compassion and honesty. I mean, once a human being is afraid enough, you never know what they'll do. And let me tell you, anytime you hear a voice inside your head that says, you can't handle this, I mean, this is something that not even you and God together are strong enough to cope with. Anytime you hear that, you know that's not from God. Ahaz, he led a fear-based life, and it was a disaster, and it destroyed him. All right, second story here. This one's found in Isaiah 36, and this takes place several decades later. The northern kingdom no longer exists. In 712 BC, Assyria indeed swallowed it up and sent the people into exile. And of the 12 tribes of Israel that God started with, of the 12 tribes of Israel, now only one is left. Only Judah is left. Judah is holding out. The southern kingdom here is holding out, mostly because of the courage and faith of their king, a man named Hezekiah. And once again, Assyria looms real large in this story. The king of Assyria is prepared to squash Hezekiah and the southern kingdom, Judah, like a bug. He'd prefer to have Judah surrender so that nobody'd lose any soldiers in any fighting there. And he sends his officials to kind of intimidate Hezekiah and his people into surrendering to Assyria. And in verse 4 of chapter 36, the Assyrian field commander, like a general of sorts, is speaking to Hezekiah's officials. And he's saying this outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Everybody in Jerusalem is on the walls listening, and their fate kind of hangs in the balance. Here's what we read. This is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? That's the question. Come now, he says, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you can put riders on them. All right, he's taunting them here. You don't even have enough soldiers to be able to have trained riders for 2,000 horses. He goes on, furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy this land without the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it. Now, this is a very, very intimidating, taunting speech against Judah and Hezekiah. Verse 11 there. Then Eliakim, Shebna, and Joash said to the field commander, please speak to your servants in Aramaic since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall. All right, they're saying here, let's make private negotiations in Aramaic, kind of an ambassador's language, because the people on the wall, most of them, they wouldn't understand Aramaic, but they understand Hebrew. Well, verse 12 says, but the commander replied, was it only to your master and you that my master sent me to say these things, and not to the people sitting on the wall who, like you, will have to eat their own filth and drink their own urine? And at this point, I just have to imagine everybody in the city on the wall saying, what's that he just said about eating our own filth and drinking our own urine? That does not sound good. I mean, he's deliberately trying to embarrass, intimidate, and humiliate them. Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. And then he just goes on in that fashion throughout this whole section. You see, the Assyrians know once people are living in fear, their faith, their loyalty, their unity is gone. I mean, fear destroys confidence. Fear turns people against each other. Fear is the great enemy to spiritual community. And let me tell you, in your small group, in your family, in your circle, I mean, every time you choose fear over self-disclosure, every time you choose fear over a needed confrontation with another person where something ought to be said, every time you choose fear over expressing affection that ought to boldly or tenderly be expressed, every time you choose fear over just telling the truth, telling it in love, but just telling the truth, every time you choose fear, community dies a little. Authentic community, it needs to be fought for, and it'll mean that fear will need to be overcome a lot. In chapter 37, Isaiah comes to Hezekiah now. And Isaiah has been through this before. He's seen kings come and go. He saw Ahaz give in to fear, and he tells Hezekiah the same thing he told Ahaz decades earlier. Trust God, he says. Don't give in to fear. And Hezekiah does not surrender to Assyria. He stands firm in his faith. Well, the king of Assyria hears about this, and he sits down and he writes Hezekiah a letter. And the letter comes to Hezekiah, written by the king of Assyria, his enemy, the big superpower on the block. And imagine for a moment that you're Hezekiah. I mean, there's been no battle yet, right? Back in those days, there was no way to get word from things, no email, Instagram, Twitter, not even a telegram. One day, these messengers, they come to you and they've got a letter. And this letter, it's a message from the king of Assyria, and it's life or death. And Hezekiah sits down to read the letter. This is in Isaiah 37, verse 10. This is coming from the king of Assyria. Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says, Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my ancestors deliver them? The gods of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad? And he just goes through all these different people that he's destroyed. What makes you think you're going to be any different? This is terrible news. The king of Assyria is saying, I'll completely destroy you and your puny little nation, just like I've destroyed every other nation of your size. And he could do it. Humanly speaking, this was no contest. This was like Bambi meets Godzilla. It's bad news for Hezekiah, and it's bad news for the southern kingdom. So here's the question. What do you do with a letter like that? What do you do when you get the worst news you've ever gotten in your life? Well, here's what Hezekiah did. And this is a tremendous verse in the Bible. Isaiah 37, verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. Hezekiah takes his greatest burden, his greatest worry, his greatest fear, and he's very open about it, and he expresses with his body the anguish that's in his heart. And he does exactly the right thing. He just spreads it out before God and he prays. And he prays one of the great prayers of the Bible. It's in verses 15 through 20 there. And he says stuff like, you alone are God. You alone are God. You made the heavens and the earth, nobody else. And you, God, can deliver your people. And so deliver us so that everybody will know that you, God, you alone are God. And he prays this prayer. And God sends an answer through the prophet Isaiah. God has Isaiah send a message to Hezekiah, and here's how the beginning of it goes. Because you prayed to me, God says, because you prayed to me, God hears and God answers, and Hezekiah will be delivered, and the people in the southern kingdom, the people of Judah, will be delivered. Because you prayed to me, God says. Because you took this piece of paper and you spread it out before the Lord. You didn't give into this downward spiral of fear and anxiety that caused you to disobey, to say, I can't cut myself off from that option. You came to me and you took this piece of paper and you just spread it out before me. Now, here's my question. What do you need to spread out before the Lord today? We get letters from Assyria all the time. People in our world, People in our church just live under so much pressure. And anytime you get a piece of news or even a thought that would pressure you into anxious concern or tempt you to live in anxious fear, even for a little while, or disturb your sense of living in God's love and care, that's your letter from Assyria. So what's your letter from Assyria? What's a little piece of paper you need to spread out before the Lord? I mean, it could be about work or school or about your family or your friends. Maybe it's about a relationship, maybe your marriage, maybe your kids, maybe your parents, maybe your health, maybe your financial situation. You know, it might be an email that cut you, or maybe it's a painful letter from a lawyer's office. Maybe it's just deep-rooted anxiety inside you, and you don't even know completely why it's there, and you'd make it go away if you could, but you can't seem to. You just can't seem to. Hezekiah spreads what he's most concerned about before the Lord, and God hears and God answers. And in a miraculous way, an angel of God comes and completely routs the Assyrian army. And they go home, and Assyria goes into a decline it will never come out of. But Hezekiah discovers he was never really alone the whole time. And you're not alone either. You know, the greatest form of communing is not our technology, as great as our technology can be. I mean, it's not cell phones or text messaging. It's not even conversation. It's prayer. Prayer is instantaneous. It knows no physical boundaries, has no limits. That's why the Bible says, pray in the Spirit at all times. Pray with all kinds of prayers and ask for everything you need. Never give up, Ephesians says. Because when we work, we work. But when we pray, God works. You know, it's an interesting thing when attempts to change the world begin with human efforts. They have a way of ending up doing more damage than good. So we begin with prayer. As people who belong to God, as the church, we begin with prayer because prayer changes things. Because we're made to want to be connected to somebody greater than ourselves. And so we pray. You know, the natural condition of life apart from God is fear. We are not meant to be secure in ourselves. We are not the kind of creatures who can engineer our own safety apart from God. But when God comes into a life, something else has the possibility to begin to happen. When God comes into our life, anxiety can begin to decrease and a sense of peace and freedom can begin to get stronger. And when you get to this place where there's a sense of peace because God's presence in your life is stronger than the sense of anxiety and worry in your life, that's a real important stage of spiritual growth. And of course, for most of us, there's a certain kind of cyclical dimension to the experience of anxiety and of peace. But over time, as this sense of peace grows and expands, it becomes habitual to do what Hezekiah did. The single most important activity in the moving us in this direction, the single most important activity is prayer. Don't you believe otherwise? Always, the Bible opposes worry on the one hand and urges prayer on the other. It says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your requests to God. So today, I want to invite you to do what Hezekiah did. I want to ask you, wherever you're watching this, to take out a pen or a pencil, a piece of paper of some kind. And I want to ask you to write down the word or phrase that most represents what you're concerned about. What's your letter from Assyria? What do you need to spread before God? Again, it might have to do with your work or a relationship or your family or finances or guilt or sin. I mean, this is between you and God. And you just write that down and you put that piece of paper in your hands or put it on your knees and you do what Hezekiah did. You give it to God. Whatever your greatest concern is right now, start talking to God about it. Just spread it out before the Lord. And we'll celebrate communion now, which reminds us that because of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, we have this connection with God now. His love and care are displayed for us and are there for us. And we can live in them each moment of our life. And you thank God for Jesus, and you bring whatever you've got before him now.